participants have joined us. So I'll go on mute now. And Noam, you can take us forward.
Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of Grassroots Justice Network, I want to thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Noam, and I'll be the moderator for today's conversation. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. This event will have simultaneous interpretation in English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. To activate it, please look for the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, click on it, and select the language of your choice. And a few reminders to help our interpreters. Kindly mute your microphone if you're not speaking. If possible, be in a quiet space so we can hear you clearly. And if you have access to a headset or a microphone, please use them during the call. And please also try to speak slowly so we can capture your message. If there are acronyms, please spell them out first. And lastly, for our participants, please also introduce yourself in the chat, share your name, your location, and your organization. And while we're waiting for, people to join, maybe we can start off with a slam poetry by Gloria. A brief intro about our artist. She's a Beninese slam artist and psychologist and a co-founder of an INGO, Future for Future. And through slam, she denounces social, climate, and gender inequalities, using words as a tool for empowerment. And as the National Executive Secretary of the National Movement for Girls, she advocates for the empowerment of young women. She coordinates the Gender and Inclusion Department of Future for Future, promoting civic participation and the legal empowerment of communities. And her outstanding leadership and activism earned her the Amazon for Human Rights 2023 award at the Oscar de Amazon in Benin. And we're grateful to have you as our guest artist today, Gloria. I'm passing it to you now. If you're ready. Gloria, can you hear?
Une Amazone. Je ne suis pas que la voix des sans-voix. Je suis celle qui les aide à élever la leur et à ne plus croupir sous leur croix. Car connaître la loi, c'est exister.
Knowing the law is to resist, apply the law is resisting, and shaping the law is to decide. Under our skies, the burning wind of injustice blows, and the most vulnerable are the first victims. For them, justice is an empty word, peace a privilege, and law a weapon in the hand of the powerful. Women, the lungs of our economies, are denied access to land. Children are exploited. Men desperately search for a better life. All made worse by poverty, climate change, pollution, and the loss of biodiversity. Whole communities live under the weight of silence, fear, and doubt. Who dares to rise? No one. And yet, together, we can. And yet, we can because the real answer is us. Rising together is more than walking side by side. It's reaching out to the one who falls, listening to the one who doubts, and building a road where no one is left behind. We are trained youth who
qui
question,
refusent le silence
who
des
refuse the
injustices,
silence of
qui veulent
injustice,
comprendre la
who
loi
seek
pour ne
to
plus la
understand the law so as not to fear it,
l'utiliser pour se
to
défendre
use it for
et la
defense,
façonner pour que
and to
nul ne
shape
soit
it
critiqué.
so that no one is forgotten.
S'élever ensemble,
Rising together is weaving bridges between
faire
our
du
voices,
savoir une arme et du
turning
mouvement
knowledge
un
into a
espoir
weapon
collectif.
and
Nous
movement
venons
into a
tous de
collective
quelque
hope.
part
We all come from places
où l'injustice plane.
where injustice
Mais
still
nous avons
hovers.
choisi d'y
But we have
retourner
chosen
pour
to
y semer
return
les
there
graines de
to sow the
l'écologie.
seeds of legal empowerment.
Connaître la loi,
To know
c'est
the
ouvrir
law
les yeux
is
de
to
nos
open the
communautés.
eyes of our communities.
L'appliquer,
To
c'est
apply
refuser
it
la peur et la
is to
peur.
reject fear and
façonner,
abandonment. To
c'est
shape it
écrire notre
is to
propre
write our own
notre
future
propre avenir.
and say,
Et
this time,
cette fois-ci, c'est nous.
this time, we decide.
Cette fois-ci, c'est nous.
This time,
qui
we
décidons.
decide.
Le mouvement de jeunesse,
The
ce
youth
n'est pas un
movement
simple
is not
groupe.
just a
Ce
group,
n'est pas
it is
un
an
simple
echo.
groupe. C'est un
It is an
écho
echo of
qui
souls
refuse la
that
soumission.
refuse
Un
submission,
souffle qui redonne
a
voix à
breath
ceux
that
qu'on a fait
restores the
taire.
voices
Une école
once
pour la conscience
silenced,
où l'on apprend que la
a
justice
school
n'est
of
pas un
awareness where we
privilège,
learn
mais
that
un droit.
justice is not a privilege but a right.
Aujourd'hui, nous faisons
Today,
entendre nos
we
voix.
make our
Nos
voices
communautés
heard,
se lèvent
our
pour
communities
répondre au
rise
combat.
for the
C'est
change
déjà
they
ça,
seek,
la liberté.
and that already is freedom,
C'est déjà ça,
the
le
first
premier
step
pas vers la
towards justice.
justice. Je suis une Agotier,
I
une
am an
Amazone.
Agoji, an
Je ne
Amazon.
suis pas que la voix
I'm
des
not
sans
just
voix.
the
Je
voice
suis
of the
celle
voiceless.
qui les
I am
aide
the
à
one
élever la
who
leur,
helps them
à ne
raise
plus rompre
their
pour
own
leur foi,
and no longer
car
languish beneath their burdens.
connaître la loi,
For to know
c'est
the law is to exist.
l'appliquer,
To apply it
résister,
is to
la
resist.
façonner.
To shape it is to decide.
Seul, nous n'y
Alone,
arriverons pas.
we cannot make
ensemble,
it, but together we can.
ensemble, nous y arriverons. C'était sublimaire. Merci.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gloria, for that powerful poetry. I hope everyone's feeling a bit more inspired and energized about what we're going to discuss today. And I was going to tell people to take reactions on the Zoom, but it seems like everyone's already doing it. So thank you for that. So I'd like to get started by introducing a little bit about, Namati and the Grassroots Justice Network. For, those of you who don't know, Namati works on legal empowerment in countries such as Sierra Leone, Kenya, Mozambique, and the US by training community paralegals to tackle. Oh, I was talking on mute. Apologize for that. Thank you again. I'd like to get started by introducing a little bit about Namati and the Grassroots Justice Network. For those of you who don't know, Namati works on legal empowerment in countries such as Sierra Leone, Kenya, Mozambique, and the United States by training community paralegals to tackle some of the greatest injustices in our times. Namati convenes the Grassroots Justice Network, who is organizing today's webinar. And the network is a global community consisting of more than 17,000 members who represent over 4,400 organizations in 189 countries. And network members work across different sectors from, land and environmental justice to gender, criminal justice, citizenship rights, and more. And the network is committed to help communities to know, use, and shape the law so that they can overcome the injustices they face. And the main purpose of the network is empowering people to invoke the power of the law to defend their rights. And they do this by connecting people to learn from each other, which is what we're doing together today. So if you'd like to stay tuned for further opportunities, I encourage you to do so at the link we're going to share right now. And the network is also launching the Grassroots Justice Network Academy next year. It's a world-class institute and learning community focused on strengthening grassroots justice work. So please make sure you're connected. So coming back to the webinar, the discussion for today is divided into two parts. So the first part is about how we engage young people in the struggle for justice. And then in the second part, we'll talk about, insights on legal empowerment and movement building. So today's theme is focused on youth, and it'd be good to have a sense of youth participation among our audience as we're preparing for the discussions. So if you're youth or working closely with youth organizations, can you guys share some reactions on Zoom? It could be a thumbs up, a heart, or a smiley face, anything. Oh, wow. And, wow. All right. So thank you, everyone. It seems like we do have many youth participants today, and that's really exciting. I hope this webinar is a helpful tool for networking and learning for you guys. Today, we want to focus on youth movement because these movements facilitate social change. And if you're following some of the things happening around the world, from Nepal, Indonesia, and the Philippines, to the United States, Argentina, Kenya, Madagascar, we see the significant role of youth participation in justice movements with the role of social media and digital platforms in empowering these movements. So as an example, Nepal elected their first female prime minister through voting on a digital platform called Discord. So I think it's quite interesting to see how young people bring social media and technology into some of the most significant political movements in their countries. And I think there's a lot to learn from, young people when we talk about mobilizing. And, in the second part, we'll discuss legal empowerment because legal empowerment strengthens movement building. And Namati talks about legal empowerment as a cycle that consists of, knowing, using, and shaping the law. And there's a lot of work and organizing that goes into empowering people to know about the law, use it to protect or demand their rights, and apply these knowledge and skills to shape the law. And the most common impact we observe from communities who have gone through, the legal empowerment process is an increase of agency. So from willingness to act against injustice to taking actual actions. And by talking about legal empowerment and youth movements, our hope is that youth organizers and activists could help, turn anger into actions, create safe space, and center empathy in the conversations. So with that said, we have youth organizers with us right now who will share about how young people are organizing in their context, what strategies have worked, what have not worked maybe, and how the legal empowerment approach informs or strengthens organizing. And we'll also hear more about the lessons they've learned, how they counter harmful narratives and sustain movements under repressive regimes. And hopefully, our discussion today could also shed some light on how solidarity and legal empowerment can shift power from the ground up and what's possible when young people lead. So I'd like to invite our panelists to introduce themselves in their own words. We have about 1 minute for each panelist because we have a lot to cover today and time is as always limited. So maybe we can start with Diana and then Mikhail, Waringa, and Billy to share a little bit about themselves, your name, your organization, the country you're working in, and the problem you're trying to solve. So I'm passing it to you first, Diana, if you're ready.
Hi, sorry, I was trying to get off mute. Hi everyone, my name is Diana Imbert.
Bonjour à tous, je m'appelle
I am here
Diana
in the
Imbert.
United States.
Je représente ici
But I
les
live in
États-Unis.
city and feel a lot
Et
closer to
je
the
suis
city
à
than
New York et je
I do the
me sens
country.
très identifiée avec cette ville.
I work, I'm the
Je
co-executive
travaille
director of an organization called
avec
Defining Gravity,
une organisation qui
that
s'appelle
really
Définir la
tries to
gravité
demonopolize and democratize
ou
the
la
law
pesanteur, je ne sais
and
pas.
put it directly into
Nous
the hands of young
essayons
people
effectivement, de mobiliser les jeunes et de mettre les actions entre leurs mains. Voilà.
All right, thank you. We have Mikhail.
Hola, hello, ¿se escucha bien? Perfect, yes. I'm gonna speak in Spanish.
Je vais parler en espagnol. Donc, quelques mots en espagnol. Maintenant, je change de langue.
Hello, everyone.
Je
It's a
suis
pleasure
enchantée
to be
de
here
vous
today. My
rencontrer. Je
name is
suis
Michaela. I'm in
basée
Buenos Aires, in
à Buenos
Argentina.
Aires,
I'm drinking my mate.
en
Maybe some of
Argentine,
you
à Buenos
know
Aires, pardon.
about
Et
this.
j'ai
It's
mon maté
something
avec moi. Vous connaissez cette boisson
we
très
take
typique argentine.
Soy Brasil, estoy en Sudamérica. Soy el cofundador y actual director de Consciente Colectivo, una
and
organización
director
Conscience
of Consciente
Collective, qui est une
Colectivo, a
association
youth
de jeunes
organization that works in topics
qui
that have to
travaille
do
sur des
with
problématiques de conscience
social
collective,
and
d'organisation de
ecological
jeunes.
topics. And also, I
Et
am one of the
nous avons
public
aussi
representatives
travaillé
of the
à
Espoir
l'implantation
Agreement,
de
which is
la
a
mise
very
en place de
important
certaines mesures après
agreement,
l'accord de
which I'm
Escazú.
going to speak about later. It goes deep on the
Ça
defense
approfondit
of
sur la
those who
défense et sur
defend the ecology and human rights. Maybe you know, but Latin America and the Caribbean are considered one of the most dangerous areas globally in terms of human rights defenders. And I'll leave it here.
All right, thank you, Mikhail. I think we have Waringa with us.
Sorry, I'll just stop you for a minute, Noam. I just have a message for the interpreters. We're hearing French in the English channel, so if you
Oh.
could help sort that out, I'll work with you separately.
Okay.
Hello, everybody. Very excited to see you. Very excited to be here in Spanish. My name is Warenga Wahome. I am from Mathare Social Justice Center, a small town in Mathare, Nairobi, Kenya. I am a lawyer in practice and advocate of the High Court of Kenya. I also coordinate the Legal Empowerment Network here at Mathare Social Justice Center. I'm excited to learn and hear about how different people are using grassroots justice and how people are using the law as a tool, to advance legal empowerment and the people's cause. But most importantly, I'm excited to hear. I'm excited to share.
Thank you. I hope the interpretation is going well. Akrati, any update? Or should we move on?
Yes,
Okay.
we can move forward. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Billy, can you also introduce yourself a little bit?
Thank you, Nuam. Mabuhay. I'm Billy Blanco from the Ateneo Human Rights Center in the Philippines. Just very quickly, the Ateneo Human Rights Center is a subunit of the Ateneo Law School, but we operate as a non-governmental organization. So we were founded almost 40 years ago after the after the People Power Revolution that toppled the Marcos dictatorship. So we were born out of the conditions that there was a need to really organize for the protection and promotion of human rights. And up to today, we see that the work continues. I'm very, very excited to be in the company of very passionate people doing important work in other regions. And yeah, I'm excited for this conversation today.
Thanks, Billy, and thank you for all of those introductions. To start us off, I'd like to ask the first question to Diana about engaging young people in justice movements, because part of what you're doing is empowering people with the same foundational knowledge that attorneys have, differences and similarities across contexts. What are the strategies that have worked and should be brought back? How do we simplify narratives to connect people directly? So, for example, how do we tell people, this affects you and here's how, in a way that's easy to digest? Are there could help answer these questions?
Thank you. Yeah, I think what's really the most interesting is that when thinking about really engaging young people in like the struggle for justice, what is really the most clear is that young people already care. So they're already invested in the movement for justice. And I think, you know, what you're really doing is sort of taking that energy and giving it a home such that they know what to do with it. Because I think in some ways, at least what we've learned is that young people are already feeling viscerally the cost of living, the realities of this climate emergency that we're living in, the criminal legal system, and just, you know, all of the negatives of society fall on the backs of children. And I think in this current climate where children have so much visibility to what's happening and so much education, right? They have it at their fingertips with social media. They're seeing for themselves everything. And I think what we have been finding really is that what they need is tools. And I think that at Defying Legal Gravity, that's one of the things that we have been really prioritizing, which is that the law is an imperfect tool, but it is a tool that could be utilized. And you know, if we have all these barriers as we do in the United States, and I'm sure that's very true across the globe, that there are lots of barriers to being able to access legal information and legal education. And I think that that is by design, right? The law is the rules of the game. It's how we, you know, control things. It's how we make people act. It's everything, right? And so that is something that I think lives in certain people. And so I think really trying to put that power into the hands of the youth is really critical. So that's first and foremost, which is I think a strategy is really to know and trust that youth understand what they're experiencing from lived experience and not just like abstract concepts. I think the second is that we really need to transform education from just education into mobilization. So how do we actually get youth not only learning something and being aware of something, but really giving them the education that moves them to act. So I know that like in the US, there's a big civic movement, like let's get people voting, and that's great, but we also have to energize people to get them there, to actually get them to do the thing. And I think that, again, giving them the education that really empowers them versus just has them learning is a real thing that I think is critical. And then similarly, youth are great about working with each other. And I think that having them understand that they are collectively in something together and giving them spaces to connect, to come together, to be able to talk about what they're experiencing, and then marry that with, you know, real power, like agency and the ability to do things, goes a really long way. Sorry, I'm just checking on time because I don't want to talk too much. And then I think that they have the other thing that I would say is that we really just need to listen to them. I think that they have, as we've seen, they have the ability to use art and storytelling and digital literacy in such a way that is so compelling that they know what they're doing. And I guess that's my big message is that, you know, they know what they're doing, and what we should be doing is creating real pathways to power. And then lastly, ensuring that we can sustain the work that youth are doing through joy and community, because I think those are the things that are ultimately going to allow, you know, young people who are in the struggle for justice, like really getting excited about it. I think once they can name what's happening and they understand that this is not just an individual problem, but a systemic problem, which I think, you know, in our view, teaching them the law really gives them an understanding of the ways, and not just teaching the law, but teaching it through a really critical lens that allows them to understand these are structural things that exist, and these are structural things that must be taken down in order to effectively make change. So that's what I have for now.
All right. Thank you so much for your answers. You know, what you described about, I think, you know, this law is being an imperfect tool, but a tool nonetheless that we can use to make changes resonate with me a lot. And you know, what you're doing is giving the space to youth to talk about the things that they are actually experiencing. And you know, while legal expertise matters and it has its place, people shouldn't have to be, you know, lawyers or go to a law school to understand what rights they have or how their rights have been violated. And I think what you're doing here is making sure that everyone has access to legal knowledge and information, and especially youth, and give them the space to talk about these things. So, Mikhail, maybe you could also share some insights on how we can communicate rights in everyday language as we try to shift away from, abstract languages like human rights talk in order to deepen awareness and engagement in a practical way.
Thank you very much. I have just read that there are some troubles or issues with the Spanish translation, so just to check that it's everything okay, I'm gonna switch to Spanish, para chequear que esté correcto la
I just
interpretación
want
en
to check
español.
that you're receiving the interpretation into Spanish. I see that. Okay, everything's okay. Okay, I am going to time myself so that I don't go over the minutes I have. But I want to say, certainly, I have more doubts than certainties. I think we are in a moment in the world, and in Argentina is not an exception, nor is Latin America, in which at least I am struggling to understand where we are. I don't understand where we are. Every day I understand the word least. So I just want to share some questions and so reflections so that maybe we can reflect together after this webinar finishes. So first of all, I think that those of us who work in human rights, we sometimes think that everybody knows what human rights are, in fact, and that's not so. And sometimes that's our initial diagnosis, and it's an error. And really, I would say that it's even a little bit suburb that to like arrogant to think that everybody knows what we're talking about. For example, in countries like Argentina, and I'd say in all the global south, most people just basically are trying to see how to make ends meet, how to try and work, live a little bit better, and how to take care of their family and their dear ones. And sometimes we make conversations too complicated. Narratives are too complicated when we speak on human rights. And sometimes we in the end, it's like a ghetto of privileged people. I don't want to say I don't want my privileges in a country like in Argentina, where many people live in poverty and can't make ends meet. I am happy that I have a house where I'm living, I have my clothes, I can eat, I have all my basic needs covered. So this is a privilege, I know. And I know that many people that work on human rights, I'm not saying all, but many of us have similar privileges. And I think this is not a problem, but I think it is important to be coherent, to know that from where we speak in and from where we say what we say, to know what our position is. I'm a lawyer, and I think that sometimes when we speak about rights and all these language, we think that everybody knows their rights, and that's not so. And I don't think this is the case only in Argentina. I imagine it happens everywhere. And I think that if we continue thinking that everybody knows their rights and everybody knows their national constitutions and everybody knows all these, our diagnoses are going to be wrong all the time. So in a context in which we have extreme right governments that deny the human rights agenda, that deny the climate change, that deny feminisms, we have to change our diagnosis. We have to really be honest, intellectually honest, and think and know that we are not winning the game. You know that in Argentina we like a lot of football, so I do a lot of analogies with football, but I think we are losing the game, and by a lot. It is not a good moment. It is not a good moment for human rights, and I have the feeling that we continue speaking about human rights as we spoke decades ago. The same narratives, the same ways of speaking, the same way of saying why human rights are important. Every time there are more people that don't trust in the human rights of the United Nations. This is so many people say, Michael, everything is very nice in the United Nations, all the international rights are very nice, but I don't have access to drinking water. I don't have access to housing. So And if I oppose the government, they persecute me. So your human rights are in paper, they're very nice, but really, practically, what are they? And we have to acknowledge the situation, because if not, we are going to continue being very arrogant, thinking that with human rights, we work everywhere in the world, and now the situation is the contrary. And I want to close because I know I have hardly any time left, but I think we have to speak easier. We speak really in a very complicated way. It seems as if we kind of take joy of speaking in a difficult manner, because it seems that we're very intelligent and very capable. And many times I think of this, and I see myself in these circumstances, and I think, why? Let's speak easily. Let's speak with our neighbors in a simple way, so that our neighbors understand us, so that everybody understands us. Because if not, we speak between us, between a ghetto of already convinced people. So we have to try and speak in a simpler way, and build on new narratives, new ways of speaking, so that human rights are not this nice thing on paper, but something that really, really transforms the life of millions of people everywhere in the world, and especially in the Global South. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mikhail. That's really powerful, and there's a lot to unpack there. But I think, to summarize, I think essentially what you're telling us is that the languages we use around our movements have an impact on our ability to mobilize people, and that narratives are powerful. The way we construct narratives around our movements can either make people join us or turn away from us. So building on what Mikhail said, Waringa, could you also discuss a bit more about how we should construct narratives that invite people to join the movement? And maybe you can also share some insights around digital organizing during the finance bill protest in Kenya.
Thank you very much. And thank you for Diana and Mikhail for the presentations that they've made. And I think they are a progressive type of conversations, because I think if Mikhail kept talking, I would have been left with nothing to say, because he has left where my conversation begins on why the discourse of human rights is now a discourse that we need to lay to rest and advance the discussion. Advance the discussion to a point where we can talk about social justice. We can talk about, dig deeper into the problems that people are facing and look at, because the human rights concept or discourse is a human rights, it kind of fragments common rights. It treats the arms as different as the head, as different as the legs, whilst it is one body. So when we deal with questions of social justice, we form critical questions. And of course, it becomes an issue-based type of grassroots organizing, where it is a clear understanding that real power is got in the grassroots, and real power is where people demand for their dignity. And in our society now, people are demanding their dignity from informal settlements. People are demanding their dignity from workers' unions. People are demanding their dignity based on the different issues which they are organized around. People are organized around health and can demand for proper healthcare. People are organized around water. But sometimes we must be able to differentiate between what is an issue and what is a problem. Because sometimes we organize around problems instead of organizing around issues. And I think in the analysis of looking at what is the difference between a problem and an issue, I think a critical thing in the formation of that narrative is the number of people who are affected by that specific issue. You then look at, are people willing to act on this issue? That if people are organized around this specific problem, are they willing to act on it? Is it a question which is winnable? If people come together and make wins, is the problem that is facing them right now winnable? And of course, you must have a target, a target whom you're facing, and you're saying that you can reach this target and you can organize people around a certain target, so that it also becomes winnable, because you have to have a target so that you know who you're organizing people around. So I can take an example in the protest that we did last year in 2024, the finance bill protest. At that time, people were organized around the question of taxation, which is a question which is cross-cutting everybody. So many people are affected by this problem. Another issue is that the question of what people willing to act. I think People had been pushed to a point of hopelessness, which is the case in many other countries all over the world, that people have been pushed to cases of hopelessness. People have been pushed to cases of vagary because people can barely survive. The social economic conditions have gotten so tough for basic survival. People are lacking in basic needs and lacking in their means of survival. So in the differentiating between the problem and the issue, so that you can form issue-based organizations, because when you're organizing in the grassroots, and in my experience, when you're organizing, within a grassroots justice network, it is that you cannot deal with problems. You must organize people around issues. And of course, the finance bill protesters, and they had a target because we could ask the president, we refuse this bill. So we are testing the sovereignty of the people. It's a critical question which is raised as a single issue, but it can raise to ask, why is land, for example, owned by a few people in Kenya? Why is it that production is being done by just few companies in this country? Why is it that workers have no rights? Why is it that people are living in shanties while other people are living in opulence? Why is it that people live in such horrible conditions where they cannot access clean, safe drinking water? Well, there are people that spray their parks and golf courses, with water which is equivalent to the water which is used by a whole community in a certain informal settlement of Nairobi. So such questions start coming up and people start raising them and asking, how is it that this difference between, people in this country, why is it that human rights is becoming now a conversation only when, so for example, when the president would say that we are demanding for peace, and people would ask, peace for who? Is it peace so that people can continue looting the resources of this country, or is it peace so that people can be able to afford healthcare, which is a right, it's a social economic right under the Constitution of Kenya? So when we talk about security, are we talking about security for the people who want to keep looting this country, or are we talking about security, for people who demand education, for people who demand healthcare? Or we'll just say that these extrajudicial killings that are going on in our country are enough. So we did justice for the people who were killed, during the protests and who have been killed all over the years. The Mathare Social Justice Center has, for example, been organizing. And I think when organizing around narratives, it is a critical narrative where someone can look at what issue is critical at that point. So when we're doing grassroots justice work, it is not the law which comes first, for example. The law only comes when it is needed, because as Diana was saying, that it is a tool. So yeah, I think I can introduce it such and say that I think, just to advance Mikhail's presentation, that narratives are no longer formed around the human rights concept. Narratives are now being formed around social justice issues of land, housing, education, healthcare, clothing, dignity. Yeah. I hope I didn't interrupt too much time because I was unconscious. So.
All right, thank you, Waringa. And that's really interesting to hear your thoughts on the bill protests. And I think what you're essentially telling us also, I think, is the need to, come together and shift from, indifference to self-respect. I think one thing I also noticed about the Kenya bill protest, I think, is, what happens after the protest occurred. So, there were a new Cyber Crimes Act that comes up after the digital organizing, if I remember correctly, which is supposed to suppress freedom of expression that came out of digital organizing. And, and this kind of thing happens everywhere in the world, like you said. I think a lot of the times laws and, narratives are unfortunately used as a weapon. False narratives are used as a weapon to oppress people. And it's no wonder that, when we talk about laws, most of us often associate it with elites and politicians rather than everyday people. And so, Billy, could you also share some of your thoughts around how we can use legal empowerment to shift power from the ground up? How do we meet people where they are?
Thank you so much, Ram, and thank you so much to Diana, Michael, and Waringa for a very rich discussion. I think if this went on, I too would have nothing else to say. But based from my experience, I think a lot of my insights come from the fact that a few years ago, I found myself as a student activist. So I was protesting in the streets around the time where there were extrajudicial killings and one after another human rights violations. And from that time, I realized that while it was important, right, organizing the youth, you can't really organize around anger the entire time. right? And the point is, how do you transform that anger into something more transformative? And I think it's so important, as Waring has said, that especially at a time where human rights, Miguel highlighted it, that human rights has become still, we continue to teach human rights in such a language that has not changed through the years. And so it's become so alienating, especially for communities, right? It's become such a big concept, an abstract concept. And I think the point really is to start to shift the narrative, right? Not looking at the law as something to defend, but rather as something that should be used to serve the interests of communities who the law should be serving. And I think for me, especially organizing or forming the next generations of human rights advocates and lawyers now, young people often think that engagement means just showing up, right? Or just, showing up with their energy. And while that's important, I think what's important is not just reacting, but actually the idea of presence and actually witnessing in that encounter. And that you can only do that by meeting the people with where they are, right? The community becomes something that not that you go to, but rather you go from. Right. And in our work with the Ateneo Human Rights Center, we try to, as much as possible, meet the communities with where they are. Because it's the communities, they hold the knowledge, they hold the histories, and they hold essentially the answers to so many problems. And especially one of the stories that always sticks with me is a story of one of a Hanunu Umangyan, who is a native indigenous child that I met a few years ago. Let's call her Ella. So Ella, I met in the mountains of Oriental Mindoro, and one time she asked me to carry her because it was slippery, it was muddy, it had been raining all day. And I realized that there was no point in wearing my sandals because I would slip. I would slip down the mountain because there was so much mud. And then I thought that it would be important to remove my sandals. And from that narrative, I think it's so important sometimes that the point is to walk with communities. The point, will never understand, will never fully understand what communities go through, but we can try to, in as much as possible, walk with them. And that means really meeting them with where they are, but more importantly also joining them in actually listening, right? In how they articulate the problems and what justice is for them. And so we don't define what justice is for them. And I think that's so important, especially in this day and age, right? That the young people actually stand with humility, with presence. And for me, the entire point always is that working towards a world where there are no more lawyers, because everyone, the communities, right, they would be empowered to fight for their rights. And on another level, that they would already know there would be no human rights violations, and that human rights would not be empty words on paper, but but actually a reality for all. And that, I think, is important. And justice in that way, or actually begins with walking with communities, empowering them, accompanying them. And, it all begins with just being there, actually, and listening to them and breaking bread with them and journeying in their plight. Yeah, so I think that's it.
Thanks, Philly. And I'm with you on communities already
Je
holding
crois
the
que c'est
answers.
tout.
And that sometimes, all we need to do is to take a pause and reflect. And we'll discuss more about working with communities working with communities in part 2, because we as a collective also need to learn about how to work with communities in a way that matches their needs, rather than bringing what we think are solutions to the problems that they're facing. And it's a learned skill, and it's easier said than done. So I'll get back to you on expanding that idea in part 2. But before we move on to the next part of our discussion, we're going to have a quick Zoom poll to see what people think is the most powerful catalyst for youth-led movement today. And I think you should be seeing a poll on the Zoom screen right now. If you can, please let us know in the chat. Please take some time to reflect and answer. It's really interesting to see the lines go move around. All right, I think the majority of us chose building safe, strong communities. Following it up closely is knowing your rights and using, legal knowledge. That's really interesting to see that. And thank you for answering the question. This Zoom poll is just a way for us to, internalize what we've discussed so far. And as we're reflecting on, how to engage with young people, I like to move on to the second part, which is about legal empowerment and movement building. And I'd like to share, some context about what we mean by legal empowerment before we dive into the discussion so that everyone's on the same page. Legal empowerment is a community-led bottom-up approach. And contrary to the traditional legal aid approaches, which often treat people as victims requiring a service, legal empowerment is about building the knowledge and power of people to solve injustices themselves. So this means that we're shifting from, I will solve this problem for you to we will solve it together. And in the process, we will grow. So for this to happen, we have, grassroots justice defenders, such as community paralegals, community organizers like our panelists today, human rights activists and community-facing lawyers at the forefront of legal empowerment. And what they do is they help raise awareness of rights, laws, and policies. And they also help people navigate, complex legal and administrative processes and pursuing remedies. And they also support citizen engagement in law and policy reform. And what's also significant about the legal empowerment process is that it works in diverse issues and contexts. So if we look at our panelists today, they're working in different regions of the world and in different sectors. But what ties us together tonight is the legal empowerment approach to solve problems. So with that said, I'd like to turn to Mikhail at this time for our first question. Across the world, we have situations where there are good laws that need proper implementation. And in other cases, though, we have, problematic laws or the total absence of laws. And in these situations, there's a need to advocate for a new law or a change in existing ones. So keeping that in mind, could you please tell us more about your work with the Escazú Agreement and the aspect of shaping the law? And maybe you can also briefly explain, what the Escazú Agreement is for, people who aren't familiar with it.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I switch again to Spanish. Voy a poner el cronómetro, así no
I'm
fallo con
going
el
to time
tiempo.
myself again.
Explico brevemente, pero
Okay, I'm
también
going to
sirve hacer la
speak very
siguiente pregunta, a ver si
shortly
quieren
on the
responder por el
Escazú
chat, que es,
Agreement, and I also
¿quién
want to
escuchado
ask you a
alguna vez hablar
question.
del Acuerdo de
Has
Escazú?
anybody heard about the
Yo dejo ahí
Escazú
la pregunta
Agreement?
para quien quiera ir
Can you answer in the
respondiendo, pero
chat
mientras lo voy contando
so
para
that
quienes
we
no lo
get an
conocen.
idea? And
Como
for
dije
those of you who
anteriormente,
haven't heard
el
of
Acuerdo de
it,
Escazú
I'm
es el
going
primer
to
acuerdo
explain it briefly.
ambiental
It is the
para América
first
Latina y el
environment
Caribe,
agreement for
con lo cual
Latin
es un hito
America
muy
and the
importante.
Caribbean.
Es un
So
acuerdo
it's a
desde que entró en
really
vigor que
important
tiene menos de
agreement.
5 años,
It
2021, por
started
lo
in
cual, acá ya digo
2021,
uno de mis
so it
primeros
has less than
argumentos, que
5
es,
years. And this is one of my main
ustedes a un bebé
arguments.
de
It is a
menos de 5
baby.
años
It
le
is
pedirían que
less
cocine,
than
que haga las
5
compras
years
y
old.
que también pague
So
el
would you
alquiler?
ask a
Yo
baby
no.
to
La
cook,
misma
to
analogía
do
la
the
hago con un
shopping,
acuerdo
and to
que
take care?
involucra a terceros
I
países,
wouldn't.
que
So
es,
I wouldn't ask
creo que
the
muchas
agreement
veces le
that involves
exigimos
so
a
many
ciertos acuerdos o a
countries.
cierta
I think
normativa que de la noche
sometimes
a la mañana
we
solucione
ask
todos los problemas
certain
habidos y por haber.
agreements that
El
from
Acuerdo de Escazú tiene
one day
4
to
ejes
the other,
centrales, los
it
voy a decir
basically
muy
solves all the
brevemente,
problems.
que es el acceso a la
The
información en asuntos
agreement
ambientales,
in
acceso a la
Esquatu has
justicia,
5
acceso a la
things:
participación
access
en asuntos
to
ambientales y cuarto,
participation,
como dije
access to
anteriormente,
justice,
la protección de los
access to
defensores
information,
ambientales.
and the protection
Sabrán que en
of
América Latina y el
environmental
Caribe
defenders.
el rol
As
de
you
los
know,
defensores
in Latin
ambientales y de
America
derechos
and the
humanos es
Caribbean, the
sumamente
role
importante.
of
Y como
human
dije, somos
rights and
considerados una región
environmental
sumamente
defenders is
peligrosa
very, very
porque no es que solamente a
important,
las
and it is
personas
a
se las
very dangerous
amenaza por la
region
labor de
because
defensa, sino que
people are
inclusive
not
se las
only
asesina
threatened,
o
but
muchas
they are
personas han tenido
also
que escapar de
killed.
sus países
some people have had to flee their countries and their communities because of this. I don't want to go deep on this because I think the context we live in, we are 2 clicks of distance to find all the information. So what I want is to reflect a little bit on other things. So basically what the Escazú agreement is, it wants to kind of raise the bar in things that have to do with the environment. And this is not easy with so many countries involved. But me as a lawyer, I believe that in many places like in Argentina, we have a very good legislation, but it is not applied. So we have a challenge here. So we have a good legislation, we have really progressive, good national constitutions, but they are not applied, they are not implemented. So this is a main challenge that we have. And I believe also that frequently civil society is not able to see how the legislation is actually implemented. So what we do is we demand that the legislation is applied, we do advocacy, but then we can't speak about implementation because the implementation takes years, it takes patience, it takes time. And now all these things seem impossible because we hear the audios at very fast. We live very fast and we don't have the patience for processes that imply years of work. So there is no agreement that is going to change historical process from one day to another. No agreement is going to change this. This is a baby agreement. It's not going to solve everything from one day to the other, but there are advances. The thing is that in our region, the problem is that in our region, we have a kind of pendulum between right and left governments all the time. When all these governments change, they erase what the other government did before. So it is very hard to sustain any process that lasts more than 4 years, what a government lasts. And there's another thing that worries me, and it is that in Latin America, there are more and more people that prefer authoritarian governments because they believe that they are going to solve the problems and they're going to. And there is a data that is more than 50% of the population in Latin America doesn't believe in democracy. And this is something that is growing all the time. So sometimes we say, oh, democracy is very important, everybody's going to agree. But what happens in many countries, like in Argentina, for example, is that those of us who were born in democracy also have these memories. For example, I'm 27-year-old, and I know that every year my quality of life is worse. Every year, and I'm going to close here, but because somebody told me that my time was running. But in Argentina, the right-wing government, Javier Milei, maybe you know him, there's a very important group of people that voted him. That was the young people. So we have to put this conversation on the table. What happens with this legislation that we have? Sometimes we say we have to follow this legislation, and then in the real world, when we try to put it in practice, nothing happens. So we have to be sincere. We have to be more self-critical. We have to debate inside our own human rights movement and think, what can we do in this context, in such a difficult context we're living? Because sometimes we say, okay, everything is going to go well, everything is going to solve. We are the good guys, and there are the bad guys. Maybe we're the good guys, but we're losing the match. We are losing the game. And much of what we're doing is that because we're not doing it correctly.
Thank you, Mikhail. I appreciate the fact that you shared about the Escazú agreement. And I think all of what's been laid out in the agreement, actually, based on what you were sharing, highlights the importance of citizen engagement, regardless of whether the implementation takes time or not. I think the key component of that agreement is citizen engagement. And if we're talking about engaging citizens, we do also need to talk about access to information and knowledge. And I think, Diana, this is where you can also share a bit about your work in teaching law and rights to young people, not just so that they can protect themselves, but so that they can also help others do the same. So how have you seen this kind of peer-to-peer learning or, multiplier effect strengthen communities' ability to claim their rights?
Yeah. So at Defying Legal Gravity, we teach what in the States is called the foundational first year law school classes. It's what creates the foundation for every attorney in America. And clearly this is knowledge that can be sort of democratized. It doesn't have to be, only exist in the hands of lawyers. It's sort of a fabrication of society that we believe that for some reason only people who make it to law school deserve to have this information. We truly believe that everyone should possess this information and should be able to engage in the legal system with a foundational understanding that really gives them the agency to act and exist within it. And obviously the goal really is to make sure that everyone is legally literate. And I think that we believe that once youth really begin to kind of understand the architecture of power, which we believe exists, in how rights are structured, how laws are written, how decisions are made, the history on which our legal system is founded on, and sort of the structural and systemic barriers at play that have always existed, something really shifts in students. I think that they start to see the law as something, not as something like distant or intimidating, but really as a language that they can actually speak and partake in. And their frame of mind really sort of shifts into one that is just like, I'm living in the world and things are happening, to really understanding the ways in which the law creates the environment around them. And so I think that what happens when you have that kind of knowledge is that you naturally then start to share it to other people. Because when someone comes to you and they say, oh, this thing is happening, instead of it just being a thing that is happening, your brain is like, actually, this is not just a thing that's happening, right? This tenant is actually withholding power specifically for XYZ reason, and they're violating this law. And your brain is able to really think like a lawyer, and have that training. And I think that the community then starts to say, oh, I didn't know that. So in some real ways, we've seen students on an interpersonal level expand the legal knowledge of their communities and help their communities advocate and activate their rights. Whether that's something like, actually, this is a problem that can be resolved in the civil legal system. You can take this to a court. You can get, you can get damages for this. You can actually get some type of compensation for what has happened to you, right? Or you can get an injunction to stop some type of behavior, like actively using court systems, which every person should have the right to be able to go into a court system and demand justice for themselves. So I think the students activate themselves and their communities in this way. But I think the other thing is just that they are witnesses in ways now with not only like knowledge of their rights, but knowledge of where those rights come from that really steeps them in their ability to feel confident to move. And I think that that's really important in the current environment in which we're living. One of the things that we're seeing, for example, in Chicago, it's a huge city right now that is having a lot of immigration enforcement. I'm not sure if everyone has knowledge of this, but what we're seeing is that, the sort of government is complaining about the fact that the citizens of Chicago have too much awareness of their rights, and that they're standing up for themselves, and that they are being witnesses, that they're recording, that they are refusing to back down. And that is because that, there's been a lot of training about legal rights and ability there. And communities feel like they can stand up for themselves and protect themselves. So I think with Defying Legal Gravity, we've been seeing the same thing. Our students are prepared because they have this legal knowledge to activate when things happen. They don't have to learn it to do it. They can just do it because they already have that foundation. And I think that if more people have this information and this knowledge, the quicker people can activate, such that, we are not waiting and waiting and waiting until things happen, we're staying on top of what's happening with the government. And I feel like that feels really critical in these particular times.
Thanks, Diana, for your insights. I think building on the idea of multiplier effect, such as, creating Know Your Rights training for tenants, that I think you were beautifully describing and sharing, Diana. I also would like to ask, Waringa, you're also working with the Mathar Social Justice Center in Kenya, and the Mathar Justice Center is led and powered by young people from the community itself, not by professionals or big organizations. So could you tell us more about what difference does it make? How does this youth-led, community-led approach change the kind of impact you're able to have?
Yeah, I think I don't know how we deal with this question of professionals, because it also has to be defined otherwise, because I think maybe to be a lawyer also is to be a professional. Yeah, I think, yeah, sure. First, we ask ourselves, what is social justice? I think Mathare Social Justice Center is a social justice center. And, it is a social justice center which was formed out of necessity, because it was formed in 2014, actually, out of necessity, because at that time, there was huge normalization of extrajudicial killings in the slum communities of Nairobi. And of course, all over the country, but predominantly in the slum areas of Nairobi. And every day, a police officer would come if he has suspicions of beef of their own or some, because they argue that they are thieves and such, which are also mods. They would find you in a hotel, shoot you, and not become anybody's business. So it was very ruthless. You would be walking on the road every day in the morning. There's a record of a young person who is dead, in the streets. And people had normalized it because of how much fear, these police officers had been creating in the community of Mathare. So Mathare Social Justice Center came out as some people will call it an antithesis, but it came out as a reaction to, these extrajudicial killings and the normalization of extrajudicial killings. So they started by documenting these cases, how many people are being killed every day, reporting them to, the government structures of investigating extrajudicial killings. Follow-up of these cases, court solidarity and praying, and, going for public interest litigation cases to bring these cases to court and challenge, the normalization of extrajudicial killings. So people were organized around the question of extrajudicial killings. But then it raised a whole movement of people called Mothers of Victims and Survivors Network. And the Mothers of Victims and Survivors Network is a group formed by women who are victims and survivors of extrajudicial killings. And all of them have come together to not just continue being victims of extrajudicial killings, but now to become defenders and also become community protectors, to protect against extrajudicial killings. And they become like community watch. So every time a police officer is thinking about killing a young person, they know that people are conscious, first because they understand their right to life and that it is an inherent right and no one has the freedom or authority to take it away from you, however. And it took a lot of time also because it's a process which took almost 10 years. And the first publication of Mathare Social Justice Center, which was talking about who is next, like everybody was wondering who is next to be killed by, a lot of awareness conversations around extrajudicial killings, until it got to a point where the consciousness of people also rose naturally because now they are challenging extrajudicial killings. So their consciousness rises and they start wondering, Mathare Social Justice Center people, do you just take data and teach us about right to life and such? Do you wait for people to die, teach us about right to life, and then you're doing nothing about it? I think that's what Mihail was talking about, human rights discourse. Because we've taught about human rights. People have understood that, okay, we have a right to life. They have organized themselves around Mothers of Victims and Survivors Network. But now, what next? Because, again, like Diana was saying, some of these problems are systemic problems, and they cannot be resolved, using the same structures that we have now. So such a rise in consciousness, now people will start wondering, what causes these extrajudicial killings really? And of course, we understand that it is also, community organizing work will give you the understanding that these are systemic problems. But the community itself does not have the understanding that these are systemic problems. So I think like someone was saying in the chat, and also Mihail said it, that you chew this information, and when we are having conversations in our community, we start looking at poverty. Poverty as the violence that is taking people to this condition. So people start organizing themselves, now not just around the question of extrajudicial killings, but wondering, how do we break away from this poverty? How do we break away from this hopelessness? How do we break away from these conditions of, indignity? The fact that we can live without water, garbage is a normality in this area. There are no toilets. There are no any basic dignity of living like a human being. And now when people now start integrating with these questions, it is what is giving birth to other campaigns like the Ecological Justice Network, which is now a network of people who plant trees, not just because the government says we should plant trees or because everyone knows that we should plant trees for a clean and safe environment. It is planting trees in memory of every young person who has been killed through extrajudicial means. So the trees which are planted in the parks of Mathare are not just trees planted, for the sake of greening our environment. They are trees which are planted in memory of many young people who have lost their lives through extrajudicial killings and, of course, through other systemic injustices, of either connected to police brutality, whether it is floods that came and swept them away and, their lives were horrible, whether it is when the government decides to demolish homes, it is people who are remembered, as victims of systemic brutality. And of course, it has also birthed another network of women called Domestic Workers Network, because this question of consistently asking about the question of dignity and poverty, people are thinking about social economic rights. And of course, these women now are domestic workers who are coming to organize not just in isolation as people that do domestic work, but in connection with people that do waste picking. Because waste also is a critical issue which is in our community now. And of course, if you combine waste, you combine the domestic workers who labor every day for the division. Okay. But so the division just by a road, where people are taking one side of the road are the workers, and then they have to go and, clean clothes on the other side of the community, in the other side of the road, which is a more affluent sort of community. So these women who are the primary, they deal with waste in first instance. They combine together with waste pickers and environmental justice defenders, to connect this idea and start challenging these systemic questions. And of course, give more life to the Mothers of Victims and Survivors Network. Continue advancing until it got to a point where last year, it is the president who was talking about extrajudicial killings. And 10 years ago, no one could even talk about extrajudicial killings. Now, Kenyan people themselves protest because a person has been killed by police. Like these days, police officers do not just want to kill people in cells because they know it can rupture the whole country. That is agency. And it motivates me a lot because it means the work that has been going on for the many years by the community of Mathare, it is paying up because people are starting to own their agency. People are starting to say that when we lose our fear, they lose their power, that when we consistently lose the fear to advancement, even the oppressors, they lose their power. So I think how we organize is that we organize around the question of social justice, around everyday people's needs, and around the necessity to, like Diana was saying, see how we can dismantle some of the structures that continue to perpetuate, injustices in our communities.
All right, thank you, Waringa. And it's really inspiring to hear about, the Mathare Social Justice Center. I mean, what a journey. And the center is, I think, an example of what's possible when, young members of the community actively take ownership. And at the same time, I think we're also acknowledging that engaging with communities itself can be tricky. And in legal empowerment, we often talk about walking with communities, but we also have to keep in mind that when we say communities, we're talking about a diverse group of people who may have different sensitivities and responses to the issues we care about. So linking it back to, what you were saying before, Billy, in part one, what does walking with communities look like in practice for you? What do we mean when we say walking with communities? And how does it shape the way you think about justice and organizing?
Thanks so much, Nam. I think earlier when I talked about walking with communities, it's as much as it is symbolic as it is practical. Symbolic in a sense that we're literally not walking over them, not overtaking communities, but really at the core of it all, meeting them where they are, whether it's in the mountains, in the islands, across the seas, knee deep in mud. It's quite literally going to them and actually listening to their stories and their plight. But as I said, it's also practical. In the work that we do at the Ateneo Human Rights Center, we have a long history of cultivating the next generations of human rights advocates and human rights lawyers. And part of our program is really making sure that our students are ready to walk with communities, to advance access to justice through grassroots empowerment. So much like Diana's, we try to prepare our students such that they know the law, know that the law is a tool, right? That the point is to look beyond what is written in their books, in the laws, and really seeing the faces that who the law should be serving, right? We know that laws can be just, but they can also be unjust in that way. And central to that experience is really immersing themselves in communities, right? Being and walking, being there, just being witnesses to the struggles of communities. And in doing so, they are able, and it informs how they do the work after. They realize that they're not only there to really live with communities, to understand what the issues are, but also to respond to it. So whether that means empowering communities in terms of paralegal trainings or documentation work, advocacy work, or just, helping the communities understand what the effect is of certain laws to them. And, just another story that I remember, based on my experience, this time with indigenous peoples, in Infanta, Quezon. So these are the Dumagat that stand to be affected by the construction of the Kaliwa Dam. So that's a big hydropower dam. A few years ago when I was there to do paralegal training, I remember I was a first year law student, and after explaining to them how to write a sworn statement and to document violations to the free, prior, and informed consent, they told me, forgive me, it's in Tagalog, but I'll translate it. They said, attorney, I wasn't a lawyer then. They said, attorney, baka dapat makapagpatapos kami ng katulad nyo para kami mismo ang tutulong sa amin. Or in English, they said, attorney, maybe we should be our community should be able to send one of ours to school so that they could finish law just like you, so that it would be us helping ourselves. And I think that's so important. As I said earlier, the point literally is to journey with communities, to empower them such that they no longer need lawyers because they already know how to defend their rights and what they need. And in the context of legal empowerment and actually contextualizing what walking with communities also looks like, I think as lawyers, our paradigm often is transactional. We think of the case of the law and the client. But in really using legal empowerment as a tool in walking with communities, the point is to make it more relational, right? We see the bigger picture, we see the issue in context, and it becomes not just about providing the answers, but really listening to how the communities themselves name the problem. And again, as I said, what justice is for them. And oftentimes when I ask this in communities, especially with indigenous peoples, it's something that's something that they've known all their life. So for some indigenous people, justice is for them to be able to tend to their land, right? Because their land is part and parcel of their entire identity. It's something as simple as that, right? And even that is something that has so many barriers for them to reach. So I guess ultimately walking with communities really, and first and foremost, it entails humility, but also a certain kind of presence. And at the end of the day, it's an accompaniment, not a substitution. We're not here to speak for them, but we're actually here to walk with them. Whether that means, right, in co-creating learning in spaces, in paralegal trainings, in community dialogues, in workshops, but also if it means, walking with them to Congress to be able to change the law, right? In courts to be able to challenge injustices done to them. I think, it's really at the end of the day being there, and our role is to bridge and not to direct them, because as I said, they have the answers with them already.
Thanks, Billy. What you described, I think, helps us visualize the idea of walking with communities more clearly. My takeaway from your answer, too, is that it can also be a humbling moment for us as we understand more and more about the communities we work with and the problems and the barriers that they face. I think it also forces us to be honest with ourselves as we learn more about issues from a community member's perspective, not as an outsider or a third party. And hopefully, that realization can help us shape the way we think and talk about justice and organizing in the future. So, with that note, I want to say thank you again to all our panelists for your patience. I know that you guys have a lot to share, and you're sharing them in a limited amount of time. So hopefully we get to learn more about you and your work from the Q&A section. But before we jump into that, we want to share another Zoom poll. I think you should be seeing the screen right now. So, legal and activism. Right. So yeah, please take a moment to reflect your answer and then we'll move on to the Q&A. Thanks everyone for participating. That's really interesting to see all that answers. So yeah, I think we covered actually all of the options laid out here in different ways throughout the conversations. And I hope that, this question helps us reflect a little bit on youth-led movements and legal empowerment. And right now, I'd like to give some time to Q&A actually, because we already have 2 questions. And we do have about 10 minutes. So please feel free to ask a question or write down the questions in the Zoom chat and we can ask them for you. I'm going to start out with the 2 questions we have here. Please give me a moment. So the first question we have is how do we create an enabling environment for people, youth, to express themselves freely in countries where freedom of expression is strictly banned, and if otherwise exercised, imprisonment or intimidation is excited. So does anybody want to answer the question? Maybe, yeah, anybody. Billy, you want to start out? Okay.
No, Waringa, go ahead, please.
No, I was going to say, please say it again because I was trying to look for it whilst you were saying it, so I must have missed it.
You're on mute too. You're on mute.
I'm on mute?
Noam, you're on
Sorry.
mute.
Nuam is.
Okay.
Yes,
saying
I
I
think
didn't get to hear
I think somebody should be copy pasting. Right. Yeah. So how do we create an enabling environment for people to express themselves freely in countries where freedom of expression is strictly banned? And if exercise, imprisonment and or intimidation is exercised.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Yes, I think to give a quick note about our country is that when we lost one of the prominent figures of Kenyan politics, Raila Odinga, the same day they made the announcement that the former prime minister has, gone to rest, is also the same day that the president signed other bills, which were waiting for his assent. And he signed a bill. One of them was the cyber crimes act that he signed into law. And what it says is that some of the things that even writing anything that can be perceived
qui pouvait être,
as
excusez-moi, le son n'est pas très bon.
things that can be perceived as insightful.
Donc ces choses peuvent être,
When you say, for example, that people must occupy parliament and fight for, fight against punitive taxes, that the government will consider as insightful, that it is inciting people to go home in fear. So now what they're trying to limit what people post online, because people, I think, have become very audacious now on Twitter, on TikTok. People are audaciously making posts about, being critical to the government. Last year, we saw many people getting abducted because of being critical in parliament of the government. This year, we've seen people being abducted, being charged even with terrorism. You wonder how, and also what a Shan definition of terrorism, because what is terrorism if it's, not stealing resources of people that are meant to, deal with healthcare, education, and such. But it is very difficult. It is not easy. I cannot answer and say that it can be easy. I think it is what we are reminded that we must be able to at some point lose our fear. I think someone said that when people come together, and organize in strategic means, whether online or offline, mostly online and using digital tools. Digital tools now, there are ways that people can be creative. I think there are conversations, taking an example with what was happening yesterday in Tanzania when their internet was shut off and they switched to VPN. People are being creative on how you keep up your communication, because as long as you're aware of everything that is happening, and we're keeping tabs with people, because also the government can be very rude to kill young people who try to raise their voices and such. But even the Law Society of Kenya was very on the front line of defending people when it came to such. And whenever there are communicative alerts, because when people make tools that you can communicate where you are, for example, during the protest, we had apps where they could tell everybody where they are when you log in. So when you log in, you can tell where is safe, where is not safe, people are communicating. And these are apps which are not specifically accessible to. Of course, they can infiltrate such systems, but people can keep tabs on each other. People can be able to tell, is this one safe? Is this road safe? What is happening on this side? What is happening on this other side? And also people can also be creative in their communication. People can be creative in their organizing. If you understand that you're organizing in a very repressive government, you can be creative in your communication. You can be creative in, who you put on the front line. Sometimes we have women, older women who are passionate about this country. And whenever it is not a young person that needs to be on the front line, you can be creative. You can call your mama. And, the government will be more restricted on punishing mothers than they will, because when they see young men, they are brutal. They will release all forms of violence. But when they see women and older women, they will be reluctant, because I think we sometimes beg for the humanity of those people that oppress us. But I think it cannot be easy. Either way, I can keep talking, but please, Diana, help.
Thank you.
No,
Mikhail, you
yeah.
want to answer? Oh, Diana, please also. Yeah. You were on mute.
Oh, I just say I agree with everything.
All right. Maybe we should move on to the next question, and I'll call out the panelists. I think that'd be more, I think it would be better. The second question is, and I'll also copy and paste on the chat. All right, so somebody's here. Faced with widespread crisis, young people find themselves at a crossroads. Holders of government bonds are amplifying the privatization of public economies, and armed groups are fighting to plunder some of these economies. Young people who defend rights are becoming exhausted and are aligning themselves with these political, economic, and military actors. How can we advance generational action so that justice does not remain abstract? That's a very loaded question. Anybody wants to take a jab at it? Maybe Mikhail, Diana, I'm calling out. And Billy, I have my last question for you. Okay.
I switched to Spanish again. Qué pregunta, por eso pongo la cara que pongo.
Wow.
Qué difícil.
What a question, that's so hard.
Yo creo,
I think we haven't yet spoken about mental health, and this is also very important when we speak about youth. I am 27, as I said, so I'm still young, even if not so young. But something that really worries me is that the crises and the mental health crises that adolescents live everywhere in the world is terrible, and how this impacts activism also, and or participating in social movements, in organizations, in a context in which we're living this huge big crisis. I think this we don't speak so much about mental health because of different taboos, because of misinformation, and we don't speak enough about what to do, not only to try and avoid burnout, but also try and avoid the fact that youth people are not participating so much in social movements. I see in Argentina, for example, that many young people that participate in organizations end up leaving very soon because it is too much for them, and they are complete. They need to be. They are overwhelmed, and they feel they have to be in with themselves and concentrating in themselves, and this is something important. So we have to speak we have to speak a little bit more about how can we manage to be happy, how can we speak about happiness, because everything seems so sad. When we speak about our topics, everything is sad. And I think most people just want to be a little bit happy, just want their dear ones to be happy. And if we want young people to participate in this, they need to find happiness. If they think that everything that has to do with social movements is very sad, is very hard, maybe they're not going to join. But we have to build on hope. We need to make them fall in love with the movements so that they want to participate. Because if we're only going to speak about a dreadful future and a apocalyptic future that is full of destruction, why should I join the movement? Well, what is this going to give to add to my life? So this is why there's not so many young people that are participating in all these organizations and social movements. And I will leave it here.
Thank you so much, Mikhail, for answering the question. I think we have about 2 minutes left. So, you know, I'm sure there are more questions, and I can also see here. Maybe, you know, our panelists could also take some time reflecting on some of the questions that were asked and maybe share your thoughts around those questions here. For the sake of time, I would like to move on to closing. You know, and again, thank you everyone for your thoughtful questions, and thanks to our panelists for answering them with a lot of practical wisdom. What we've discussed today tells us that, you know, legal empowerment works even in repressive contexts, and at the same time, we all have a responsibility to challenge unjust laws and policies in order to strengthen democracy in the long run. And it's also clear to me that, you know, we can't fight authoritarianism alone, and we all have a role to play in defending human rights. And today we learn a lot about, you know, the significant role of young people in justice movements. They're showing us how to mobilize and engage with communities effectively, how to leverage technology, and what's possible when young people with legal empowerment take charge. And it's really inspiring to hear all the stories from our panelists, your experiences, and the impact you're having. I just want to wrap up our conversation again by saying that we emphasized on the role of young people today because it's critical that the momentum for justice keeps on going through the generations. And if what's been happening around the world has taught us anything, it's that even after a repressive regime has fallen or unjust laws have been repealed, you know, rollbacks on civil rights could still happen, and it is happening. And if we look at the world right now, we see attacks on democratic values on a daily basis. We see authoritarian regimes organizing and enabling each other. So it's also important for community organizers and human rights activists to also be intentional about integrating young people within the movement and building solidarity across different sectors and generations. So with that in mind, I'd like to invite people, especially young people in our audience, if you haven't, to join the Grassroots Justice Network to connect with and learn from, justice defenders across the world and participate in conversations like we did today. And also stay tuned for the Grassroots Justice Network Academy coming next year. We're really excited about that as well. So yeah, thank you again to our panelists and to all our participants for taking the time. I hope everyone goes back with some practical insights around, youth movements and legal empowerment. So thank you so much and have a great day. For the GGN Academy. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ciao. Adiós.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.